Something is creeping in, don't follow it down.
24 hours ago, I found out the person that I've been dating for the last 6 months is a con man.
That is my sister Emma. Andrew Tonks's lies had been so convincing, she'd invested $300,000 with him. However, the tables were about to turn on Andrew. What he didn't know was that Emma had discovered his real identity. But to get any chance of justice, Emma had to act like it was business as usual. Coming up in this series.
And that's when murder, all this stuff goes through my mind. I'm really, really scared.
I'm assuming Sarah has watched too much Netflix and figures I've been defrauding you. Couldn't be further from the truth.
That's what this was, a real-life story that seems so unbelievable, but it was actually true.
A true story that all starts with one simple swipe to the right. I'm Sarah Ferris.
And I'm Emma Ferris, and this is my story, Conning the Con.
There was a lot of things like that where you'd think, what the
From Stuff, a new 12-part documentary podcast.
He was into sex every day.
The Commune. Sex, drugs, and a guru called Bert. There are crimes, but this isn't a whodunit, it's a whydunit.
Good God, adults agreed to this?
The Commune. Find it now on your favourite podcast platform or at stuff.co.nz/The Commune.
You've already been welcomed to Centre Point.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and for those of you who haven't heard, I will be hosting a 12-hour live stream next Friday on July the 22nd from 12 noon Eastern Time to midnight, with a whole host of incredible guests, including survivors, experts, content creators, and authors. And we even have a whole load of things to give away, so please tune in on my YouTube or Facebook. You can find me at Cult Vault Podcast across social medias. Now on to today's episode with Patrick Ryan, cult mediation, counselling and religious conflict specialist. I loved this conversation with Patrick's keen insight after decades working in the cult education space, and I hope you all enjoy our chat as much as I did. Here is Pat. So hello, Pat, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today on the podcast about your personal experiences and the advocacy work that you continue to do today. We're going to be looking at a new group on the show, and I am looking forward to gaining your knowledge on this, your monumentous knowledge on this subject. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Patrick Ryan, and I guess at this point in my life, my life has been in the world of groups and influence. But for the last 38 years, I have been doing intervention work and cult recovery work with people. So a big chunk of that 38 years, about 23 of them, I was with the International Cultic Studies Association and helped develop their recovery workshops and family workshops. So that's sort of what my life's about.
I feel as if this wasn't just a career path that you stumbled upon. This kind of happened as a result of your time spent in one of the types of groups that you now help families recover from. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. So my first intervention helping someone leave a group was while I was still a member of a group. and that was my sister who was in a cult. And it was during my sister's intervention that I arranged and set up that I came to realize that what was happening to my sister in her Christian group was happening to me.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
So my first intervention occurred in 1983 while I was still in a group. And then I was helping on other interventions and I was still in a group. So it was about a year after that I realized, okay, I got to get out of what I'm involved in.
That is so interesting. Did you then contact the same people to help you as the people that had helped your sister, or did you kind of go through that independently?
Yeah, so it was a very different time. I got involved in a group when I was in high school. I was just about 17. It was 1975. Maybe if I give the context and get to the answer to your question.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote for my high school newspaper and for the local paper in town, which was St. Petersburg, Florida. And at that time in 1975, I'm sure most people who are listening to this probably weren't born. There was a rather famous talk show, and it was the Merv Griffin Show. So Merv Griffin was, I don't know the equivalent today, but he was the, like Phil Donahue, Oprah. He was that kind of person of that age. And Phil Donahue had learned Transcendental meditation, and he had the Maharishi appear on his show with other meditators. Grandma Walton, another thing from the show called The Waltons, Burt Reynolds, Mary Tyler Moore, Clint Eastwood, and some academics, some psychiatrists. And when that happened, about 40,000 people started learning Transcendental meditation every month in the US.
Wow.
And one of the big things that was mentioned in the show was that the practice of meditation reduced people's blood pressure. And I grew up in St. Petersburg, Florida, where the average age was in the 50s or 60s. So higher blood pressure was an issue. So the editor asked me to go write a story about this. So my next door neighbor was in college, and he had learned Transcendental meditation. And it also happened that Transcendental meditation was taught in the public school systems of New Jersey, Kansas, and California. And there was a TM club in my public high school. So it was it was the 70s. It was a different time. This seemed to be a very natural, sort of the human potential movement was like the cutting edge. And I went to a high school that was a rather cutting edge high school. So I went to write this story. And at that time, the Philadelphia Phillies, a baseball team, did their spring training in Clearwater, Florida. That's where Scientology is. That's right next to St. Petersburg. And a number of the very famous athletes of the time were learning TM. So when I went in to write the story, the person who taught me was the person who taught the athletes. So here's this kid who's 16, 17 years old, walks in, and there's these very famous athletes, and they're learning TM, and they're in my class. So I wrote to write the story, and I learned the practice. And that was an interesting experience, learning about it. So I learned the practice. It was funny because I had no knowledge at all of Eastern philosophy. I mean, it just was not, other than I'd read a lot about India, and I was interested in different religious systems, but I had no really any knowledge of it. So you went to an introductory lecture, like on a Tuesday and a Wednesday or a Thursday. There was a preparatory lecture. Then you were interviewed by the teacher, and you learned TM on Saturday morning. So as soon as I learned, I left to go to the woods to go deer hunting with my father. So I leave learning, I go to the hunt camp, and I'm out hunting deer, and had to come back the next evening for the next lesson. So this is just I'm just sort of illustrating how far away from Eastern ideas that I was. So I learned, I thought it was fascinating. And then Maharishi and the organization announced that they had done some research that found that 1%, when 1% of the population learned to meditate in a city, crime rate went down. And they were inaugurating this great research. And so I asked my dad if I could go to hear the Maharishi in Atlanta. And he said, yeah, as long as you're in school tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. or the next morning at 7 a.m. So I flew to Atlanta with a bunch of people. We heard the Maharishi speak. And the next day in class, in one of my classes, one of the exercises that the teacher gave us a metaphorical, let's say $1 million, and how would solve the world problems. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, everybody's coming up with their ways. I thought, well, I just was at this lecture. There were some Nobel Prize winners speaking. There were some very famous doctors. And, when 1% of the population meditates, crime rate goes down, and all these people are looking at me like, what? But as I walked through the halls of the school, people were coming up to me and asking me questions about it.
Right.
And then like the next week or two, there was an announcement, the morning announcements on the intercom. And they said recruiters from the Maharishi International University are in the guidance office.
Oh my goodness, you can't escape them. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. So I went and, heard that story. And the teachers at the local center, I started volunteering a little bit. I worked on an Air Force base, which is another odd thing, at the same time, after school, working in the base exchange, like the store on the base. And so the teachers thought I was like a a sort of a dedicated kind of kid, focused on this. And they invited me to go to an advanced course, which was for 1 week at a university on the other side of the state of Florida.
Right.
And the person who ran that course was Mia Farrow's sister. And her name is Prudence. Her name was Prudence. And she's the person that the Beatles wrote the song about, Dear Prudence, won't you come out and play?
Right.
It's a brand new day. This is about Prudence. So Prudence's husband was the state coordinator for Florida and the recruiter for Maharishi International University. So there's a kid, 16, 17 years old, meets these famous athletes, goes off to see the Maharishi. There's all of this buzz. The lines to learn TM at the center were long. There were doctors, there were all these, the head of the hospital was there. And I was helping do some of the instruction, and they were, you know, a 17-year-old kid, and the head of a surgeon is doing what I tell them to do. It's kind of heady. And then I go off to this course and I meet Mia Farrow's sister. And because I was so young, I was special. It was, most of the people were in college and I wasn't. So I came home from that and then announced to my parents that I wasn't going to the University of Florida, but I was going to be going to the Maharishi International University.
Wow.
And that went over pretty not well. My dad's from South Dakota. Grew up on a farm, rode a horse to school every day, and was a very high-ranking military man. And his son was telling him he was going to go to a Hindu university. And I'm like, so I basically told them, that's where I'm going to school. You can either support me or you don't support me. But if you want a relationship with me, that's the deal.
Wow.
So they supported me.
Which is great.
It is great. So I loaded up my Volkswagen and went from Florida to Iowa to where the university was.
Oh my gosh.
It's about 24 hours away. Got to this university. The day before I went, I was informed that you actually had to wear a suit and tie to classes, and you needed a suit and tie to get into the dining hall. And I'm like, what do you mean you have to wear a suit and tie? I mean, I went to an alternative school where you wore flip-flops and shorts and a t-shirt, if that. And I'm like, suits and ties? And by the way, they're vegetarian. And I'm like, this is the first time I even was aware there was anything like that. I mean, I was pretty innocent to the worldview that I was going to enter into. So I went to the university. I know we asked a question, but I'm going to about how I started, but I'm giving you sort of this history. So I went off to the university. I was there for 5 years. And I will say that in many aspects, in many regards, was a very good school. It taught in a very unique way. And that is that they only taught one course at a time. So the first year were survey courses. They were 1 week long. And it was 2 classes a day and on Saturday. So you were in class a tremendous amount of time. And then the second, third, fourth years were 1 month courses. So my professor in marketing came from Harvard and taught the Harvard curriculum for a month. My professor in physics came from CERN in Switzerland and taught that. So the Maharishi developed this method of teaching that you could bring in some of the top-notch people to teach. And so on that level, it was a really interesting place. Most of the students, there was a couple of us who were 17. Most of the students were in their 25s, 30. They had, gone to other schools. So I was very, very young and naive when I went. So in those method of teaching, you would take academic courses for a couple of months. I will tell you now that it's not like this anymore. And then you would take a month of what was called Forest Academy, as if you were in the woods and you were going off to meditate, but you didn't, you were in your dorm. But during this month of this Forest Academy, they increased the amount of meditation significantly.
Right.
And basically your eyes were closed about 20, 22 hours a day. The only time your eyes were open is when you were eating. And many people would eat with little signs on their shirt that said "in silence," which meant they were not talking. you were assigned a buddy, or you had a buddy who was with you at all times. You couldn't go to the bathroom alone, write letters home, watch TV, read newspapers. You couldn't do any of those things when you were on this forest academy. You were focused on the knowledge, Maharishi's knowledge. So there's this academic stuff, there's a little Maharishi stuff to it, and this intense month of Maharishi stuff. And the conclusion of these courses was that it's possible for a man, a human, to move toward a state where he makes no mistakes, that everything that the individual does is correct spontaneously. So if you wanted to go into the supermarket, you wanted to buy toothpaste, you would spontaneously buy the right toothpaste. If you were, the example that was used is if you were at the beach and somebody was drowning, and you were going to go out and swim to get them, the shortest way to get to that person who's drowning might be take 3 steps down the beach, dive in and go there. And nature would make you do the spontaneous right action perfectly. So a month on this one subject over and over and over again. And really the conclusion of that was that when a man becomes enlightened, he makes no mistakes. And who's enlightened? Maharishi's enlightened, and thus Maharishi doesn't make mistakes, and thus everything he says is correct. And so what happened is you had this kid, me. I remember I turned 18. So it was the first time it was legal to go out to have an alcohol. And I remember I had a Southern accent. I asked some of the friends, you all want to come over to my room and have some tea and let's go out and have a beer? And they're looking at me like I was crazy. What do you mean drink? I was like, I didn't know this, but after 2 months of academics, I took this forest academy, and then this transformation took place. I came in with one way of thinking of the world, and I left realizing, I could become a god. And the shift took place. And I would see year after year, the new students would come and they'd be, meh. And then they would take the forest academy. I would say, just wait till they take their first forest academy. And then they would come out in line. And it wasn't one for one at all. But for me, it transformed who I was.
Wow.
So I went through 5 years of this. And at some point, Maharishi introduced a program to gain some advanced abilities.
Okay.
And these were called perfections. And they included becoming invisible, walking through walls, understanding the utterances of any animal, and levitating to save the world. And that also sounds crazy in many ways, but the people who came from Maharishi's headquarters in Switzerland who told us this was possible were a Nobel Prize winner who had gotten their Nobel Prize in physics in 1964 for tunneling, a very famous philosophy person. These were like the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania. These were like high-level people from a student's point of view who said, I just finished the course that was 6 months long. I could levitate. And they just said that they described it as the body lifts up, moves 6 foot forward, and gently comes to the ground. So, this is and they said, if you have any doubt about it, then you should learn yourself, and then you'll know it's true. So I took the course. It was 3 months long, which was quite an interesting experience. And at the end of it, in theory, you were supposed to levitate. And I don't want to go into the minutiae of how we learn, but it involves so much secrecy and checking of our security of who we were. And because we were learning the secrets of the universe, and we would go back to our room and we practice this technique that he taught us. And I remember nothing happened.
Oh gosh. Did you kind of tell everyone that it did, though, in the same way I imagine these other people are?
We weren't allowed to talk to people on the outside. So I was in my group of people. And my group was 25 people, 25 guys. And there was groups of people. So none of us started levitating.
Okay.
And in that group, we were starting to think about why. Because we heard in other dorms, people were flying. And so we come back to the big room and they would say, how many people got off? And these people would say, I got off and I got off and I got off. And we're like, I remember we named our dorm Daedalus Air Force Base. And none of us started flying. And it was like, so we started thinking, oh, what did we do wrong? Oh, we had to be in bed by 10 o'clock at night. There was one day I went to the bathroom at 10:02. Maybe that's why. We weren't supposed to eat pizza, and I ate pizza one night. We're supposed to be totally celibate, and maybe you start racking your head as why it's not me that's doing it. So at some point, a few days into it, I was on one side of a room that was maybe about 30 feet across, covered in foam rubber. And the next thing I know is I hit the wall on the outside of the room, and I zoomed through the air. And I was screaming at the top of my lungs, barking like a dog, bawling like a sheep. It looked like the cross between The Exorcist and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And then all of a sudden, other people started like this bouncing around, and the internal experience, like a social contagion, took place. And the internal experience inside yourself with your eyes closed is that you zoom through the air. Now, I know people can't levitate. So we know that now, but I have a memory of levitating. So I have a memory of an event that didn't occur. It's a false memory because people don't levitate. But my experience is I did. And my body was filled with bolts of lightning and shaking. So this really powerful thing took over. So after this course went on, and we were now levitators, Maharishi then said that the practice of groups of people levitating together would stop wars. So at that time, in about 78, 79, there were wars in Nicaragua, Mozambique, Lebanon, Israel, Iran, and he sent teams of people to these hotspots, as they were called, into hotels in war zones, covered with foam rubber, bouncing up and down like they're levitating to stop the wars. So, I mean, people believed it. So after that, I was just about ready to graduate. Maharishi wanted us to move into cities and create what he called ideal villages. So a bunch of us came to Philadelphia. I'm from Florida, and we essentially bought up a whole street, not every house, but most of a street in a very marginal area. I spent the most for my home. It was $7,900. Most of them were $1 because they were burnt out shells. And we lived in a community of people who levitated twice a day to save the world. And so while I'm living in this community, I have 4 sisters. My father called me and said, Pat, your sister's joined a cult, and we need you to come and talk to her. And I'm like, Dad, she's a crazy Christian nut. I've talked to her. I have no desire to hear anything she has to say. She's crazy. And your son, for all practical purposes, is an outstanding young Hindu man. I had a business. I had 27 retail stores. I had employees. I had a life. He said, look, son, everything you've ever wanted to do in your life, I've supported. And I'm asking you to come talk to your sister, because she will not talk to any of us. Everybody who's talked to her, she has cut off. Anytime we bring up anything about this group, she cuts us off. And I think you can talk to her. And so I'm like, okay, that's a little gut manipulation, but that's true. Dad sent me to Maharishi, and he paid for it. And he paid for me to learn to levitate. And so I'm going to do what my dad asked. So I flew to Florida. And he said, before you talk to your sister, there's a bunch of books about the group she was involved in. It's called The Way International. And in those books, there's some criticism to the Maharishi. We don't believe that. So I drew lines through those chapters. So don't bother reading those. But read the stuff about the way. So of course I read the things about TM. And to shorten the story a little bit, ultimately I convinced my sister in a roundabout way to come back to Philadelphia to meet a friend of mine who'd been a high-ranking member of the Way International. And it's somebody I'd only talked to on the phone, but I presented it as if this is somebody I knew. And she agreed. And she came back to my house in the middle of this TM community. And this woman came to the door. Her name was Lois Patton. I'm forever grateful to her. And I gave her a hug, and she sat down and she started talking to my sister about this Christian group and how it manipulates people, disguised techniques of hypnosis, behavior modification, all those types of things that you talk about in intervention. And I was sitting there going, oh my God, this is exactly what they do to me. And as she went through this process of describing to my sister how this manipulation takes place, I was thinking, this is what happens to me. So I, for the first time, gave myself permission to ask the questions I was not allowed to ask.
Internally?
Internally. And then I went off to a TM advanced course with 8,000 people levitating together. And people said, Pat, what are you doing for a living? And I said, well, two things. One is I have an import company, and the other one is I'm doing the programming of people in cults. So they're like, wow, what's that about? So that's how I sort of started. And families started contacting. It was a network of people, and the world of intervention was kidnapped to programming, and I was not into that. And they thought, well, if you could reach somebody in a Christian group, maybe you could talk to my kid. So that's how I sort of got into this. And at one point in my life, in about 1987, 1988, I remember I was at a gift show selling our product in Minneapolis. I had to sell about $500,000 that weekend. And in the same convention center that was this gift show was another convention for Christian healers. And this was to teach people how to do slaying in the spirit. And so I look outside, and these people are like touching people on the forehead, and they're falling. And I literally walked away from my own booth, and I went in just to watch what makes these people tick. And it was fascinating to me. Why do people have these internal experiences? How does that work? And I went back and I talked to the person across me. I said, you want to buy my business? Because this is not interesting to me, selling products. And so what's interesting to me is, why do people experience the things they experience inside themselves that bind them to different belief systems? And that's how I got going.
Oh, Patrick, that's just giving me chills. That has given me like goosebumps all down my arms. Oh my goodness. Oh. Your reaction to witnessing that was so strong that you just decided in that moment that you wanted to pursue understanding that like as much as possible.
Yeah, because I had this internal experience that I described when I learned to levitate, that I zoomed through the air and I hit the wall on the other side, and I had no alternative explanation of how that happened. What happened inside me? Why did I feel bolts of lightning going up and down in my spine? How does that happen? So when you've never had those experiences and now you have them, one, in my case, takes the doctrine, the teachings of the group, and marries it with the experiences that you have inside yourself. And together they create this cocktail, this very powerful cocktail of experience and information. So the environment I was in said that people could levitate. The context is that people could levitate. I had this internal experience, and the only way I could explain it was with the language that they gave me. And so what happened in this intervention with my sisters, I had a new language for explaining what happened to me.
Wow.
And so that, I'll just add a little bit to this equation here. I was a very angry young man at that point when I realized that the organization had lied to me. And so I asked them for my money back for the levitation course, which was $1,407. I didn't ask for the $30,000 or $40,000 for the university education, because I wasn't totally complaining about that. I just said, look, you knew that people don't levitate, and you lied to me. And I just don't accept that you lied to me. And I just want my money back. And they refused. And I said, well, then I'm going to have to sue you. And so I sued them in federal court in Washington for fraud and for negligence because they lied. And I thought that if spirituality had anything to do with honesty and truth, they needed to be honest and truthful. And so That process of suing them introduced me to a whole host of other people, because I was in a sort of this odd dilemma, is that I had to explain to a jury of my peers, which in Washington at that time was largely a population of people who were poor. And I had to explain that why this college-educated white kid from suburbia, from an upper middle-class family, could believe they could levitate and he wants his money back. That's like, say what? This is craziness. So we needed experts to explain why. And one of them was Dr. Margaret Singer. I don't know if you know her name. And another one was Dr. Charlie West. These were the sort of the people that were the luminaries is the wrong word, but these were the people that were the intellectual powerhouses at the time of understanding influence and control. The people who treated the prisoners of war who came up from Korea. And so they helped me gain an understanding of what had happened to me. So to illustrate this, one of the experiences that even when I quit meditating, I actually showed you a video earlier of what I was like. I would be in a movie and all of a sudden I'd start feeling these bolts of lightning go up and down my spine and I start shaking, just like I would in the flying room, but I wasn't practicing anymore. So this created conflict. Why am I still having bolts of lightning? So maybe it's true. Maybe this Kundalini energy is true because I'm having it and it's just happening spontaneously. So I remember I was in Berkeley at Dr. Singer's house. She was interviewing me for the lawsuit, because she was going to testify. And she proposed to me. I was explaining to her why I thought it was real. And she proposed some other alternative explanations. One is she talked about something that people use the word hypnosis, or putting someone in a state of suggestibility where they start experiencing things. And another one that possibly I had married some trigger unconsciously that triggered this thing of these bolts of lightning, sort of two things. So the first thing I told her was, well, the research on TM shows that PMers are not easily, they can't easily be hypnotized. And the second thing I wanted to explore with her. So I remember she said to me, I was in Berkeley, a friend of mine, Joseph Zimhart, another exit counselor, was with me at the time. And she asked me a question. Well, if I was to hypnotize you, what do you think that would look like? And I said, well, I really don't know. And she started telling me this story. And the next thing I know the doorbell rang and Joseph Zimhart walked in and he said to Dr. Singer, why is Pat laying on the floor? And she said, oh, well, he thought he couldn't be hypnotized. And I wanted to show him that he had a vulnerability. And I was like, she just was talking to me in a story. And all of a sudden I was somewhere else. She said, so, you go into these very suggestible states pretty easily and you have a vulnerability. And here's how you're going to protect yourself against that happening.
Yeah, that's terrifying. Oh.
Well, it was like, if I went to a movie, I'd watch a movie and I was in the movie. I mean, I was there, but when I leave the movie, I wouldn't remember what happened. It was like very real. Like some people can read a book and they're totally absorbed in the book and they're not aware that someone walks in the room. It's lively. And that's what it was for me. So that was one part that I needed to unhook. And the other one is, why did I start having these bolts of lightning at strange times? Why would my body start shaking when I was in a restaurant or at a movie or at other times? And she suggested that in the levitation of flying rooms, there was a lot of this sound going on. And she said, I think you've married unconsciously the sound of a sigh. This has been hooked up with this energy feeling. And I started noticing that when people had a sigh, I started shaking. And so she said, so when you notice that, just the act of labeling it is a way of understanding it'll help it stop. And, soon it stopped. But Margaret was, a genius in helping me understand this mechanics of how these internal experiences were not the way not the standard, not the measure, not the yardstick that I should use for evaluating what was accurate or inaccurate. That the TM movement had taught me that the subjective world was how you knew what was accurate or true, and the objective world could fool you. And she was trying to explain to me that the subjective world can be manipulated very easily. And if you only use subjective experience as the way, as the standard, as the measure for what's accurate or inaccurate, then the person who gives you the subjective experience can control you. And so that was a very powerful thing for me to understand, is that yes, subjective experience is a component of how we know if something's accurate or inaccurate, but it's not the only thing. So we don't want to abdicate the intellect. So that was, that sort of took me off on this path. And Margaret thought that I had some abilities to talk to people. And so she began helping me learn how to do intervention work. And that's 38 years later.
Wow.
Here I am.
That is some story. Oh my gosh.
So what we try to do, at least in the style of intervention that I use, is we in some way try to recreate this experience of, is there a way to talk to somebody that they're not the designated target? They're not the designated person in the room. The goal isn't to get that person out. Can we talk? Can we educate someone in a way that they can hear it and we're not putting them in the hot seat? Can I have a conversation with the mother and the father and help the mother and the father understand what Mary loves about Group Z? Because look, group experience isn't all bad, but of us who've been in groups, there are things that were not great and there were things that we loved. So can I help families understand what their loved one loves about what they're involved in? And so for me, group involvement is something like art, an aesthetic. If you come in my house and look at a painting on the wall and you say, that's pretty ugly, Pat, why do you have that hanging on your wall? I probably wouldn't get along too well. But if you said, hey, Pat, that's a cool painting. It's interesting how those brush strokes happen. But why is this this painting of a pond have a feather in it? If you can see what I love about something, then I believe you have the right to criticize. But if you can't see it through my eyes, if you can't see what I appreciate and love about it, then my idea is that you really don't have a right to criticize. So what I try to teach families is how to understand the beauty of the art that someone's involved in, find out what they love about it, because then if you understand what someone loves about something, you can have a true dialogue. And you can find out what for that person is the thing that they appreciate. And so here I am 38 years later from leaving a group, and there are many things I still love about it. There were many experiences I still have. I still have friends from it. It is the university I went to. It's where I learned math, physics, chemistry, art, accounting, and all kinds of other things. And it also had a crazy part. Both are true. And so I think that it's important to understand what people appreciate and not to look at it as if we're all the same, that we go into a group and it's like a pressure cooker and we all come out the same out of the meat grinder. We don't. If there's 100 members of group, there's 100 different versions, because it's the interaction of an individual, me, at a particular point in my life, a 17-year-old young man, with a group at a particular point in its life cycle. And it's that interaction that comes together that can create a cultic dynamic, not necessarily. So about 10 million people have learned TM. They're not in a cult, but I was in this inner circle being a teacher and those types of things where I did this, 18 months of these advanced courses. And I was in a completely different level. So my experience would be very different than somebody else's experience. And I think that appreciating the differences is really important.
I really, really appreciate that insight and advice that you've just delivered to us there, especially when people speak to me on the show about their experiences. And actually, just yesterday, I spoke to a guest about her experiences in the group One Taste, and she was talking about how there were things that she took away. Aside from the trauma and the negative experiences, there were things that she kept with her, like female body positivity, which she'd never had in her life up until that point, that she was thankful for. And it was important to recognize that. So we had a really interesting conversation around how there are things that people learn in the groups, or transferable skills that people might develop during their time in these groups, that are not necessarily something that people should try to wipe out of existence in their lives, because it's part and parcel of the experiences overall. And I suppose that if you have had those positive interactions, that might make it more difficult to divorce yourself entirely from a movement if you're like past relationships where you're like, oh yeah, but we had so much fun and we did all these things, and you're looking at it through sort of rose-tinted glasses. I suppose someone's deconstruction journey may be hindered by kind of focusing on what was good and not taking it in the way you've just said, where you can keep the good things with you and understand that the environment itself was not good.
Well, I agree with you. But certainly when I was 23 or 24, I was very pissed off, and I would picket in front of their centers, and, I was suing them, and I was not looking at this in any kind of nuanced way. I was really angry because, fundamentally, I truly believe this, and it was a betrayal of my trust and honesty. And that was really the driving force of one of the driving forces of the anger I had. Look, 45 years later, I look at it a very different way. I have friends. We went to the university together. We laugh about the things. We had good times. It's life is a prism. It's not black and white. Certainly when someone first leaves, a lot of times it is not easy to see these things. And look, we have to be honest. Some groups are just horrible, and children born and raised in groups that there's abuse is just horrible. There's no thing acceptable about it, and for them it may not be any positive experience. I was not born and raised, although I was very young when I joined. But I can't deny that everything I learned was wrong. So physics is physics, math is math, accounting is accounting, finance is finance. I mean, they might have been colored in some way, but if I'm doing a debit and a credit sheet, it's a skill. I mean, I happened to learn it there. I learned computer programming. I mean, so I was programming in high school in the early 70s, and I learned to write software there. So it's not all one thing or the other. And I think that the media, especially, it's easier to paint a picture of group experiences of all bad. And for some people, it is all bad, or it's not acceptable. But I think that what we look at in this field that I'm involved in, of cult recovery, cult intervention, the examination of group, is there's a universe of people who've been in groups. So let's say in TM, 10 million people. That's a universe. It's thought that in the United States, maybe a few million people join and leave groups every year. So there's this universe of people who've been in groups. And research kind of indicates that about 90% of the people who join groups leave them and leave them on their own. We don't know how after long. In 50 years, most people leave. And so of those who leave, a substantial minority of them are harmed. There's a difference between a 17-year-old going into this environment and someone who's a physician who has 3 kids and responsibilities. They're going to have a different response to the same stimulus. So the universe of people like myself who may have felt they were harmed by this experience is another subset. And then the universe of that, a subset of that people are the people who come to like the International Cultic Studies Association or any of the organizations that help with people recovery. That's an even smaller subset. So the research that's done on people in groups is about those people, not on the everyone who's been involved. So I don't want to minimize at all the harm that groups can do to some people, but we also have to acknowledge that that's not everyone's experience. And if we try, as an interventionist, if I try to tell them they've all had this experience that I had, it's not real. It won't read as accurate. And so this is the way I look at it. Other people may look at it differently. So I don't think, and it's very controversial, I at one point I was an anti-cultist, a cult fighter. I was out there picketing. I remember picketing Reverend Moon's conference. I mean, I'm doing all of this stuff and going in. I mean, I was an anti-cult person. And then I learned that at least with the group that I was involved in, Maharishi labeled me, there's a term that wouldn't make any sense, but it's like the chief demon of the universe. In his terminology, it's called the grossest form of the relative. And nobody would talk to me because they knew who I was, and I was very negative. Because, well, every parents' weekend I would go out to the university and picket, and then I would rent a hotel room, and the students would ask me, "Why are you doing this?" I would say, "Come back to the hotel room," and I would start doing an intervention with them all, and I'd pay for them to fly home. And wow. I got known as somebody who was very negative and don't talk to him. But there was a lot of people who would, their families were concerned about them, and they couldn't talk to me anymore. They wouldn't talk to me because of that. So as time went on, and I became a little less angry and a little bit more nuanced, I could talk to different people. And so there's a role for people to fight organizations, but that's just not who I am. What's more important to me is helping people, families specifically, connect with their loved one, stay connected with their loved one, even if they disagree with what their loved one is involved with, because ultimately research indicates that most people leave. And can we create an environment that they can come back to that's safe, create an easy glide path for them to come back? No one wants to be told you're wrong, that you ruined our lives.
Yeah, we told you so.
We told you so. So I know from my own experience, I didn't tell my parents for 3 years that I had left, because I was too embarrassed. So I would go visit my parents. My mom would say, "Hey, Pat, we're going to eat at 6:30. It's 4:30. You better go meditate." And I would go sit in a room going, I don't know how to tell them. How do I tell them? How do I tell them? Because I'd convinced them. They paid for it. It was very confusing. And I didn't want any of those "I told you so's." And it was horrendous when a nephew or niece would say, "Oh, Uncle Pat, do you still levitate?" I didn't want to hear that. It wasn't safe. And so for me, in our work, we really try to create that safe place for people to come back to.
That sounds, like such incredible work.
We paused here for a quick break, and upon our return to the recording, Pat began explaining that he had a pet parrot that I might be able to hear in the background. We got into a short conversation about birds. As some of you may know, I have a cockatiel called Buddy, and I thought that this short aside was too good to cut out of the final episode.
I was doing my second or third intervention, and this is a funny story. Well, it's a weird story, but I was doing this intervention, and the group that we were trying to help this woman exit from was an enema cult.
Okay,
and probably never heard of such a thing. So it starts by, she just graduated with a master's from University of Chicago in business. She was looking for a job. She answered an ad to be part of a company that sold some kind of regime for health. And at the interview, they wanted you to go through the regime that you were going to be selling, which involved about 30 to 40, maybe 50 enemas a day.
What?
So what happens when you take this many enemas is that you actually upset the electrolytes balance in your body, and you can start hallucinating. And so the leader of the group that was like the recruiter could take a glass of water and run his hand over it, and people would get drunk because it became so suggestible and non-functional. So 5 days of talking to this woman, and we got nowhere. And I was sort of forlorn because like I just had a few successful interventions, and I'm like, boy, if I can't get somebody out of an enema cult, really sort of what value do I have? And so I was forlorn, and I was walking through a mall and Clearwater, Florida, and this bird, and she was in sort of the entrance to a pet shop. She went, "Hello," and I said, "I'll take her."
Oh,
and that's how I ended up with this bird.
She was like a little self-sympathy pet.
Yes, and now back to work.
When you were on your forest month in the university, is this something that you were aware of before that month arrived? Is it something that was included in your curriculum?
Yeah, but I didn't know
you
what
could
it
look
meant.
at.
There's a difference between knowing that you're going to take a time where you're going to meditate more, and then getting into the minutia of it. And the minutia of down to, like, if you had to get up to go to the bathroom, somebody had to go with you. You were put in groups of people. Each group was 6 people. There were 3 pairs of buddies. That one of the persons was the group leader. The group, you met in groups. You had to evaluate yourself as to how you were feeling every day. So you did it by color. So you could be green, which meant everything was going well. You could be red, which meant a pinch was the word. Something's not going well. You could be red-blue, which is you're progressing, but with a pinch. You had these colors. So you had to tell the group leader what you were. The group leader then told the president, which was a coordinator of a bunch of groups, who then told the person who was running the course, who then either interviewed you or not. It's like all this kind of micromanagement I wasn't aware of. And when I sued them, I was able to get all of my records. And the records, the notes on me were just kind of wild. I remember, so I'm 17, from Florida, and in the notes were, he dresses neatly, but his clothes are of poor quality. Because I wasn't buying my clothes at Barney's in New York yet. That came later, but because I didn't know. Just bizarre little monitoring of and this is minutia that I was not aware of.
It's, I suppose at this point, by the time that you are introduced to TM and become involved to the point we're discussing here, it's a very well-oiled, refined machine at this point that's being created, and all of these tactics and methodologies have been kind of really by this point, absolutely. And was it ever explained to you what the purpose of the buddy was for?
Well, yes, the buddy's job is to so in the TM cosmology, when you meditate, any thought you have when you're meditating that's negative indicates that you've lost some stress. So if you are meditating and you start saying, I hate this place, I want out of here, that is an indication of a stress that left your body. And so if you verbalize this to your buddy, I'm really feeling bad, I want to get out of here, your buddy's job was to tell you, or you're just releasing stress. So your buddy was always to remind you that you had this stress in you. And this key thing here is that there's 3.5 billion lifetimes you go through from being a spark, a rock, ant, all the way up the evolutionary scale to your human. And it's only in the human body that you have this ability to get off the cycle of birth and death and become like a god. And so to waste this lifetime that you can have this ability in this human nervous system, even the angels can't do this, would be like selling a diamond for the price of spinach. So the job of the buddy is to tell you you're unstressing, you really don't want to leave.
You mentioned that you didn't speak to your father or your parents about you leaving the group for a really long time. I was going to ask how your father felt having two of his kids return home from being in high demand groups simultaneously, but I suppose he probably doesn't match those events taking place at the same time.
No. And my sister was in for a very short period of time. So I had a sister who had a television show, and it was a workout show, and she had studios around Florida. And the sister who was I have four sisters that was in the cult, taught a class for my sister. So 3 times a week, she taught a class. And one of her students said, Michelle, you seem like you're a spiritual person. We have a Bible study at our house if you're interested. She said, yeah, I'd love to go. And after about 6 weeks of the Bible study, her children were pulled out of Catholic school. The crosses were taken off the wall. And none of that really matters in terms of belief, but these are 14 or 13-year-old kids that their whole lives are transformed in a very short time, and they're going to go off to the Ways headquarters in Ohio, where children are disciplined physically, and my father just wasn't big on that happening. So her involvement was actually a very short involvement. My parents had, I think, a lot of conflict about and guilt when I told them what was wrong, because they pay for it. And so, as hard as they didn't necessarily like it, they knew that they needed to support me. And it was at an accredited university. And my father had this innate ability to stay connected with me. So I got all my siblings except for one, all my nieces and nephews to learn to meditate, my mother, their friends, the priest at the church. I got everyone to meditate, but not my dad. And so when I would come home from the TM University, all like jazzed up on saving the world and how we could do all these, things, he would reserve 3 days where he would sit and listen to me and just listen to the insanity. And I remember saying, Dad, look, you're a Christian, right, Dad? You're a Catholic. Yes. Because I said, Jesus walked on the water, and he said to his disciples that you'll be able to do this and more. And so that's all I'm doing. Levitation is just an ability to walk on the water. That's how you become a better Christian. And he said, he would always come back to, son, what you love in life is meditating. And what I love is riding horses. And if I had 10 extra minutes in a day, I would get on a horse and just go ride, because that's what I love doing. So he never made me wrong, but he also didn't give in. Mm-hmm. And he listened. And he would come visit me at the university, and he would do his best to find professors I remember one of my professors, he said, that professor of law you have, he reminds me of an admiral I once served under. He always found the thing that we could agree on, and he didn't focus on the things we disagreed on. Because the reality is, I believe, and I believe in our work now, is every kid knows what their parents think about everything. They don't have to tell you. So I didn't have to my father didn't have to tell me what he liked and didn't like. When I knew he was visiting, all of a sudden it would all come up in my head. But if he sees these pictures, 16 pictures of Marisha in my room, he's gonna not like that. So the pictures would come. I knew what he thought. And so I started self-editing, because you know what they think. And so in many ways, I don't think that, if you've done a halfway decent way of raising your kids or your loved one, they know what you think. So if you want to stay connected to them, if you're only pointing out the things that are wrong, they already know what you think about that.
During your height of involvement with TM, before you sold your company and focused on becoming an intervention specialist, did you credit your success at any point to TM? Did it kind of happen at the same time, to the point where you had it in your mind that actually the reason everything is going so well is because of the TM practices I take part in?
Well, initially, yes, because anything that happens positively in your life is because you meditate. So if you got a parking space, it was because you meditated. It didn't matter what it was all because you meditated. I remember we called it support of nature. And I remember after I left, a friend of mine, his name is Curtis Mayu, he said, I'm still getting parking spaces. So I think it's support of Satan. So there was a time that I thought all success was because of that. And it was encouraged to actually donate money to the organization because that would help you on some cosmic level make your businesses successful. And so there was a switch that I had to make. And that switch, it was complicated. It was a complicated time. And it's not something, there's an idea that when someone's in a group, they, especially people who join group, I'm not talking about people who are born and raised, is that they become somebody different. There's a cult personality, a non-cult personality, these kinds of things. Now, I think that's real to some extent, but I think I was always me. I was me when I was in the group, and I was me when I'm out of the group, and I was me as when I'm all through. It was always me. There certainly was a different suit I was wearing, a feeling. There was a different thing that was the main focus in my life, but I always was me. I never was not me. I just was me doing different things. And it was the same me that when I knew that they didn't tell me the truth, that said, you're not telling me the truth. It's still me. And when the local center, I was really good lecturer and I was really good at recruiting people to go to the university. And I remember one day they asked me, would you give the talk? I was a teacher and I said, yeah, I'll be glad to do it, but I want to tell the truth. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, I want to tell them what it's really like. I just can't tell what we call the sweet truth, the truth that was pleasing. I have to tell them the honest truth, and then they wouldn't let me give a talk anymore. So there was the me. The me was always there. And sometimes that me was focused on a lot of other things that I thought were more important, but it was always me. And
even when you were speaking about self-editing, I think that again is you on some level kind of
me.
Always.
It's me. Mm-hmm. So certainly, people say that there were times where you'd ask yourself the question. It's a typical thing in Eastern philosophy. If the guru tells the student to jump off the mountain, will the student jump off the mountain? And this metaphor is yes, and that the guru was there to catch you on the other side. So those kinds of questions came up in my mind. But in 1978, in November, Jonestown happened, and that really shook me. And I started asking, I missed a meditation that day because it just was like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
So the next 2 years, during some breaks, primarily Easter breaks, I'd go to visit my sister in New York, and I would hang out in front of the Mooney Center across from Madison Square Gardens, and they would recruit me. And I would go through, there were 3 days of lectures, because I was trying to understand, what does this look like? What is sort of, I'm using a strong word that I'm not going to generally use, brainwashing. What does that look like? What does that mean? Mm-hmm. And they were describing, I'd read the literature that said that there's sleep deprivation and they give you bad food and all these things. And that wasn't the case. We had to be in bed at 10. We had to get 8 hours of sleep. We had gourmet food. I mean, so that didn't line up. So I'm thinking, well, if it doesn't have these qualities, then it's not that. What I wasn't seeing was a little bit broader principle. And so when you have sleep deprivation or you have poor diet, your critical thinking is decreased. You become more suggestible. And in the TM context, we meditated and we became more suggestible. So the same thing was accomplished. It was just accomplished in a different way. So these larger principles were operating, not the. But I was really trying to figure this out. What was going on? What was real and what was not real? And so I think that most people probably fall into that category. Mm-hmm. I was living in a prison of specialness for many years.
I suppose when events like Jonestown happen as well, and people are privy to the events that led up to the mass suicide, it took a lot of time, many years, to actually collect enough information to understand actually, how did that happen?
Yes.
Not just on the day or the week of,
Yeah.
but the actual overall entire scope, from testimonies and Jones's history from his childhood onwards, to be able to put that whole picture together. So, and then just three days worth of classes with the Unification Church, again, still not.
It doesn't.
So it must have been frustrating for you to be like, I'm missing puzzle pieces here.
Yeah. So maybe then it's not. I really was trying to figure it out. Because on some level I was uncomfortable, and on some level I was unhappy. And the times that I was uncomfortable and unhappy could be 1 week, and 2 weeks later I could be elated, and it was the most wonderful thing on the face of the earth. And so what I believe is that people's group experience generally is like that: happy, not happy, miserable, not miserable. This is the best thing since sliced bread, not so good. It's like that. And so there were times where a stranger, you could have talked to me and I would have left. And there were times maybe a week later that you could have brought in an army and I wouldn't have budged. All you had to know what was going on in my head. And there were so many times I wanted to leave. And I would call my sister in New York and she'd say, Pat, you're a year and a half away from graduating. Dad and mom had paid all this money. Yeah, I got to go. And I'm like, I can't stand it here. And then, the next week I'd be fine. But there were times where I didn't want to be there. So that's the thing about, I think that we got to be careful when we look at the nature of groups. And I think the media does a disservice, because I think that many people are always themselves. It's just the choices that they're making are bounded in some way.
Yeah. And again, with the media, it's not just looking at certain events or certain themes in groups that exist. I just said in a previous episode recently, when I was interviewing a former Children of God, second generation Children of God survivor, and me and Angela were speaking at length about her experiences over here in the UK, and we were just discussing the fact that when people hear about the Children of God or decide to research, the stuff that they are going to be presented with first is most likely always going to be the themes of systemic, flirty fishing, systemic child abuse. But the thing that's missing again from a lot of that stuff is the whole picture, the bigger picture, how that group began from, David Berg being like a washed out like hippie to realizing that actually he could sell this product or this promise in America, in that political climate, in that kind of social change, and understanding over the whole picture and journey of the Children of God or the Family International, how those environments were able to actually flourish and exist. And I think that's another thing that is missing from the media. And I don't know if it's because the more shocking headlines are what makes more compelling true crime.
Yes, it is what makes the more compelling stories, because that's what people are interested in watching. We have short attention spans and they want to hear these little things. The nuance part of this, the subtlety, they don't necessarily, it's hard to explain. It takes time to explain it. And, I know that like your podcast and other podcasts, a little bit culty indoctrination, they take the time to try to explain the texture of these experiences. So it's not one or the other, they're all accurate. And I think if we focus on the individual and the uniqueness of that person's experience, when I work with families and give a talk, I always say, focus on what's different about your loved one's involvement, not on what's similar. What's similar is obvious. It's the uniqueness, our unique connection with the group that helps us understand it. So the reason why I actually left TM are so obscure. I understood one thing, but they were so obscure that would make no sense to anyone else. But for me, this is why I left. It was, a philosophical, religious reason that, no, there's a mistake here. That's what unhooked it for me. It would make no sense to anyone else. So, sometimes I think, try to explain group experience like falling in love. And so when you fall in love with someone, that's not rational. You go into a bar, you're sitting there, you see someone, all of a sudden some endorphins start kicking in, you get a little oxytocin going on, and you're having a drink. All of this stuff biochemically goes on. This is not rational. This is physiological. There's an irrational component to it because you might make some selection, but it's not necessarily rational. Then you marry this person and you have 3 kids. And now you have these 3 kids, and this person's a bastard, and they're not a good mate. But it's okay. It's a complicated thing because you have 3 kids that you love and are smart and they have these great qualities, but the relationship wasn't good, but there were times the relationship was good. I think that's something we all have. We all have friends.
Yeah.
And so no one really wants to talk. They don't, families don't want to hear that their ex-son-in-law or daughter-in-law was a good person because they hurt their daughter or they hurt their son. But it's not one or the other. It's and more. It's a lot more subtle in the long run than is easily to present in a short thing in some kind of media that gets your attention, that's going to sell advertising and make people money.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're so right. And that's why these episodes are so long. And some people say, I don't like the long format podcast episodes. And I'm like, well, then I don't know if this is going to be the right show for you, because the whole story is I feel, really quite important to me as somebody that is privy to actually, sitting down and having these conversations with people, which I feel absolutely privileged to do on a weekly basis. And so I don't know, I wouldn't just want to listen to somebody's kind of 10 minutes of summary. So I actually think the journey that you took us through in the first half of the episode was absolutely incredible, and I was just sitting here like really, really enjoying that. And we kind of briefly touched on the fact that at this point, at your height of involvement with TM, it was a well-oiled machine. And I wondered if you could just give the listeners a brief history on the movement itself. Who was Maharishi, and how was this movement able to grow to the substantial size that it was at when you were involved, and the roster of names that you've reeled off and people who historically had involvement with TM, which of course gives it that level of credibility for the average, typical, everyday person that's not living in those kind of famous, rich circles to be like, oh wow, I can access the same thing that my idol or hero or whoever is accessing.
So I don't think that you can take the TM movement history out of the context of the time that it was in. And so in the US, there was something called the Asian Exclusion Act. And this essentially prevented people who were Asian or Black or brown from immigrating to the United States. So there was a lot of restriction at the time. And President Johnson eliminated that Asian Exclusion Act, which allowed people from the East to come to the US. Now, certainly this is not A or B, but we're talking about in the main. So the first major character from the East that came and introduced Eastern ideas was Swami Vivekananda in the late 1800s at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, and he introduced Eastern ideas. There was obviously other ones that were influenced, Thoreau and people like that, but this was if we take these big markers, this is one of them. The next one is Paramahansa Yogananda, who wrote Autobiography of the Yogi, who came, I guess, in the 30s or 40s, and he introduced, this was another pivotal person in the US in the introduction of Eastern ideas. So when Maharishi came in the late 50s, it was a particular time. There were people that were involved in the more spiritualist movements. And he It's very, in a short way, it's difficult to explain, but in India, the tradition that he comes from is called the Shankaracharya tradition. And we can make some vague analogy to like the Pope. And Maharishi was a disciple of that, so to speak, Shankaracharya, of the northern seat of Jyotirmath. And he died. And so Maharishi went to the southern part of India and he started teaching. And his teaching sort of caught on, and somebody brought him to, I think, Indonesia and the West. He eventually got in Hawaii, and there were people that were into something called theosophy. These were the spiritualists. So the UK had a whole spiritualist tradition with Madame Blavatsky and all kinds of spiritualists. My grandmother was a spiritualist. So those people were excited by his teachings and his ideas, and it caught on. It was a unique time. Then in like 67, 68, an organization he created was a Students International Meditation Society. And these were students at colleges who were caught on to these ideas. So initially he came talking about spirituality in a particular way. And then one of the students, Dr. Keith Wallace, I think, I forgot where he was, UCLA. I don't forget what university he was at. He did one of the first studies on meditation and found that certain things happened in the body physiologically when people meditated. And that started this sort of scientific bend on it. And so it went from the people who were learning hippies to Maharishi slowly telling people you need to get rid of those blue jeans. And there's a particular, when you're on teacher training, there's a particular videotape that you watch of Maharishi that tells you to throw your blue jeans in the Atlantic Ocean. You should never wear blue jeans. You need to wear a suit and tie at all times. And there was this movement to TM into a more cleaned up version. I would say a less honest version of what it was really about. So people who were teachers were trained to not exactly tell the truth, and they weren't told the truth. So there was a little bit of lying going on as to what we were teaching. We lied about the mantras and where they came from, and we lied about this ceremony that people went through. It wasn't honest. I would tell you now, there's a group of people who acknowledge this and are trying to create a more honest version of it, and I really respect them. So then there was this idea of forming a university in about 1972, and there was a lot of academics in the organization, and they formed this university. And so the TM movement took on this scientific academic worldview. So it evolved over time. And then at some point, he started teaching these supernormal powers, and it lost, I think, a lot of credibility. And then he started selling pieces of Indian culture, piece by piece. Like a piece of Indian culture might be that you should have this particular thing on your roof, and that costs, I'm making this up, $1,000 because all Indian houses have these on their house. Or a piece of Indian culture that you should take this kind of herb. I mean, he broke it up and sold as little pieces of Indian culture. And if we think of televangelists, so the US is filled with televangelists. I don't know about the UK, where you turn it on and, being from like an Irish Catholic family, you turn on the TV and you see this guy, people are falling around, and all of a sudden that BS meter in you goes, okay, that's craziness. And you shut it off. Because we have some sensitivity to what that looks like, cultural sensitivity. But when a Hindu televangelist comes and starts doing their show, we don't have those same filters. We don't have those ways of judging. And so to a great extent, I think he was a Hindu TV evangelist. And that's what he was. And the organization was quite amazing in his marketing skills. And I don't think it can be minimized. He soon learned that he needed to be able to duplicate himself. And in the early 70s, there was something called videotape. And so before there was the videotapes that don't really exist anymore, which you stuck into a tape machine, there was these very large format videotapes with these really heavy machines. And in the 70s, 72, 73, 74, 75, the TM movement was the largest user of videotape in the world,
Wow.
second to the US government.
Whoa, okay.
So Maharishi packaged himself in videotapes that were very carefully crafted. And so he could duplicate himself because you'd go to a center and you would be playing videos, and the refined version of who he was is what was being sold.
Wow.
And so
yeah.
he was very skillful. So when we talk about TV televangelists, often they sell things like prayer handkerchiefs. Send me this and I'll send you a prayer handkerchief and you put this on. You've heard this on televangelists do this?
Not over here in the UK.
Okay,
I mean, sometimes you might turn on the television in like the early hours of the morning and somebody's trying to sell you like this nice ruby brooch.
Yes.
If you call us now, you can get it at a discounted price of $39.99.
Well,
but I do think that there are groups and congregations that exist over here that do present themselves in frenzied states, like the ones you might see when you turn on the television in America. But I think it's very much not hidden, but I think you'd really have to go and look for it to be kind of presented to you in that way.
Yeah. So, there are people, there are these televangelists who want people. It comes out of something called the prosperity gospel, and the prosperity gospel is, in essence, that if you give to the ministry, God will give you back tenfold. And so they might be saying, send $100 and we're going to send you some water from the Dead Sea that's been blessed, or a holy handkerchief, or something that has some spiritual power. And that involves inventory. Maharishi was an amazing person because for him, he didn't, and this comes from a friend of mine, Curtis Mayu, he didn't have to sell things that like handkerchiefs. He sold magic words. And that eliminated the whole issue of inventory. He could just endlessly come up with new magic words that you bought for thousands of dollars. And now, I mean, they're not tangible. I can just change a new magic word. And now people spend $5,000 for the latest magic word that you use to meditate upon. He was a marketing genius. He was smart. He brought together some amazing people. I mean, we have to give credit where credit's due. Hans Selye, the man who first discoveries of stress. I just can't even think of all the people that would be at these symposiums that we would attend. So, in a sense, you were exposed to interesting discussions, interesting people that probably a kid from Florida would not normally experience. So it's both exciting and manipulative, and it's a lot of things. It's not one thing, and that's what I really would like people to take away, that it's just not one thing. The one thing it is, and the way that it's being sold by the official organization is not honest. They have kings and queens, and the kings and queens wear outfits and crowns, and they rule the organization. And people don't see the kings and queens unless you go underneath the surface. So it's another thing, but it has this interesting history that impacted the West, especially the US, and really is responsible for introducing the concept of meditation into the mainstream. And most research that's been done on meditation has been done by the TM movement or TM movement affiliated researchers. What they don't present is that a substantial minority of people who practice meditation develop psychological problems.
Right.
So that's part of the part that the organization doesn't talk about. And I think that that's very important, that they tell people that some people do not do well with this. But that would be like a Christian saying belief in Jesus isn't good for some people. It doesn't happen. But there is a group of people who are long-term teachers of TM that are coming forward, that are admitting that the mantras are not what we told them were. The ceremony that you go through is not what we said. And if they make this next step and say, look, it's not for everybody, then I'm full on board, because meditation for some people is good, helpful.
Is this like potentially people with a predisposition to like ill mental health and things like that, perhaps?
No, well, that possibly. The researchers that have addressed this, the two primary researchers in the past were Borovic and Hyde. They were at the University of Kansas. There was another researchers at a university in Pittsburgh, and then at Stanford Research Institute. And they found that upwards to 40% of the people who practice meditation develop problems. And as teachers, we knew people develop problems. And that is because in our training to become a teacher, we had to memorize 30 pages of instructions called checking notes. And in those notes were how to deal with some of these problems. So if a person started having uncontrolled shaking, there is a procedure to deal with that. Now, if there was a procedure, that means they knew some people had uncontrolled shaking. There was a procedure to deal with people who had obsessive thinking. So you don't have procedures for things that don't exist. So what Dr. Singer indicated in our discussion is that we're all different. And we all respond to the same stimulus in different ways. And so for some people, this type of TM meditation is quite helpful. My mother happened to be one of them who meditated till the time she died because it calmed her down. Myself and a few of my siblings, not so much. It created anxiety. And so the research is called Relaxation-Induced Anxiety, or IRIA. And it just so happens that the way our brains are wired, that kind of relaxation is not probably the best. And so Dr. Singer recommended things like lifting weights. She said, when you lift the weights, you feel your muscle, you become aware, and that's your relaxation, not this type of relaxation. So for those people like me, it's like when you meditate, the lid on the subconscious comes open and you just begin having emotional flooding. And the TM movement would say that is release of stress. And the longer you do it, the less there will be, when in fact, that's not the case. The longer you do it, the worse it becomes for many people. But that doesn't mean it isn't beneficial for some people. So the latest researcher that I think has an amazing institute is at Brown. Willoughby is her last name. And she has the institute that deals with and has trained people to deal with the adverse effects of meditation. And she was a Buddhist who practiced Vipassana, I think, mindfulness, which is quite similar to TM, although they wouldn't agree with me. And she had done a study, believing that this would help people, when she was in graduate school in Arizona. And what she found in her study was that people who did this type of meditation that she was doing did not sleep as well. They didn't go into the fourth stage of sleep like other people did. And she just thought, this is not right. This can't be. So she sort of put her research on the shelf, and she asked her meditation teacher about that. And they were aware of that, meditators don't sleep as well. So it took her some while to wrestle with the idea, because she believed this, and yet this is what objective research. So she re-examined the data and found that indeed there are problems for some people. But I don't want to say it's bad for everybody. I just want to say that for some people, it's not good. And it really doesn't have to do with someone being unstable. The organization would like to say that those are bad people, but it's just not the case. It's just that we're different. And so if we look at traditional religions, and I will use Catholicism as an example. Catholicism has lots of forms of prayer. There's the Hail Mary, the Our Father, there's the rosary beads, there's contemplative prayer, which is more like TM. There's the Jesus prayer. There are, staring at objects, the host. There are all kinds of different ways. And in Catholicism, I'm not promoting Catholicism in any way, but not one is better than the other. The church says, look, we're all wired differently. You have to find the form of prayer that works for you. And so they don't make you bad because, well, the rosary makes me go nuts. I don't like it. Okay, do something else. Talk to God, don't talk to God. Go for a walk. I mean, there's all different ways. But in the TM movement and in cultic type organizations, there isn't one solution for everyone. And that's where we run into problems. So I think that one way of looking at this is that in traditional society, so we have the Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years, and they know, okay, there's problems that happen. They got a lot of experience. This organization has been around about 50 years, and they're maturing, and they're seeing the problems. But these experiences, like I described, the flying of the bolts of lightning and all of those things, that technology or those ways of bringing about those experiences happen in all kinds of traditional societies. So in certain tribes in Africa, a young man about at the age of 13 gets circumcised. Doesn't sound like fun to me, but it's a rite of passage that the young man goes through. And that rite of passage might be, you go into the desert and you're there for 3 days alone, and then there's all the tribe is together and everyone's drumming and you're drinking, potions, and you get all riled up, and it's a long process, and then they do this circumcision, and then the rite of passage is taking place, and you no longer do that again. Groups have caught on to these rites of passage, and they keep you in it. They keep you doing it over and over and over again, and they don't have you move through to finish the rite of passage, so you get stuck. I don't know if that's helpful.
It is. It definitely is. Yeah. And I think just kind of understanding who Maharishi was and how he was able to kind of build on that empire. And as you were speaking, I was still just drawing parallels between his teachings and his method of distributing himself throughout the world was kind of similar to what I'd read in Ronit Plank's memoir When She Comes Back, when she was discussing hearing her mum listen to Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh's tapes over and over and over again from her bedroom, laying on her bed in a trance-like state. So, I mean, it seems like at that period in time, these charismatic leaders were really starting to catch on to...
I think you're onto something. We also have to think about this pre-internet. So
yeah, of course.
So the World Wide Web, well, the first sort of internet where the Americans sort of could really access, didn't happen to about 86, around 86, 87, in that era. And it was really chatting with each other. So it would be like, if I wanted to chat with you, it might be / cult info / hey, how are you doing / it was this code you had to do. And then it began to evolve with a company called CompuServe. They had this thing called the World Wide Web, and it was like, what's that? And there was this idea that you could click on a word and it would connect to another word. So there might, when you first went into it, there may have been a document on that had one link, and then it went somewhere. But it wasn't what we have now. So if you wanted to research TM, Rajneesh, Scientology, any group, it was work. You need to go to the library, you need to read books. It wasn't this easy access. So it was, I think, easier for these groups to keep these things hidden from public view. And with the advent of the web and the distribution of information, it's very difficult for people not to read or not to know. So for me, if you want to learn TM, okay. If you want to spend $1,000 to learn, okay. I could teach you for free, but you could learn. But if you haven't Googled it, and then you haven't done your due diligence, you should. And the people which I know who've donated like $12 million, $125 million to create world peace.
Wow.
That if you didn't go look at the buildings that you were supposedly built in India that you gave 125 million for to be built that weren't built, Maharishi kept you from going to India, so you didn't go see it. He had a fleet of airplanes, he had helicopters, he had diamond mines, literally gold mines. He was worth billions and billions of dollars. So there's this question that I have is, where was it that he was like a truly kind of spiritual man, an innocent person who thinks he's bringing his teaching out? And where did that come where he, in my mind, became a little more corrupted? And I say that only because on some of the teacher training courses, especially in Switzerland and in Holland, his nephews, who are the closest to him, that inherited the kingdom, the big bucks, they would work the rich people. So you might be a very wealthy person and you'd be on a course that's 6 months long, a year long, and those nephews would be working you for an investment in Maharishi's plan on this. So where is that line of believing, not believing? Where is that line of taking advantage, not taking advantage? Where is that line of, the English took advantage of our country, and where's that line of getting back? Interestingly enough, everywhere Maharishi went, he had somebody who was a skin boy. And a skin boy was someone who carried the deer skin that Maharishi sat on. So because of his spiritual energy, we don't have to get into detail, he needed to sit on a deer skin, a natural deer skin. Theoretically, the deer had died of natural causes. And this is so that some of the energy from the earth, whatever. So the honor was to carry his deer skin and be the person who did this. Most of those people were sons of the House of Lords. Most of them were the sons of very wealthy English people. When I look at that, I go, is he saying, look, okay, I have your kids carrying me around? Where is all this? Where does it come? And I don't have the answer.
No, and it's a question that I ask repeatedly when discussing most high demand groups on this show, or cults of personality, or individuals, matriarchs, patriarchs of groups. Where was there always a nefarious intention, or when was the switch, or and how quickly or how slowly did that change happen? All of those questions I have all of the time, and I don't know that we'll ever really know.
Well, I think that there's a thing I think that we think about in biology of feedback loops. So, when you're a teacher and you teach somebody something, and then they tell you that they experienced something tremendous. I experienced lifting off. I experienced seeing God. I experienced this, energy blowing from my body. That's what he hears. And then he now believes that. And then the people that are around him are all telling him that's what's happening. And then the people who didn't have them didn't get to be around him. So he wasn't getting the feedback. There was a circular feedback. And to illustrate this, there was a level of TM called, it still exists, called the 1,000-headed Purusha. These were men, and 1,000-headed Mother Divine. These are women. And they paid, I still think they paid this amount, $1,000 a month for the right to essentially serve Maharishi. And so the idea that there was never 1,000, but that's the concept. And so serving him could be to go out and teach, but serving him could be cleaning the floors. But you paid for the right to do this. And I had some friends who were on this advanced level for years. And Maharishi sent one of his closest aides to the facility, and the facility was in Livingston Manor, New York. And the man's name is Neil Patterson, still very involved in the movement. And Neil said to the men, Maharishi wants this to be the perfect, ideal the pinnacle of perfection, this environment. So if anybody has any suggestions, would you please give us the suggestions? So those people who rose their hand, they said, well, maybe if we did this, that, the other. The next morning, anyone who made a suggestion was asked to leave, because it was perfect already.
That makes me feel so uncomfortable.
So those people that didn't say anything stayed. So those feedback loops you're removing. And so now he's only hearing the good things, and the bad things, not so much. So I don't know what level of bad he heard or didn't hear. I do know from the lawsuits and doing research on the legal aspects, he was certainly aware of the lawsuits in India that occurred. So it's a question, and we will never know the answer, because we never know fully what someone else is thinking. We can speculate.
And now that you have been, I mean, every time somebody talks about Margaret Singer, I feel like she just sounds more and more like an absolute hero every time anyone ever speaks about her. So I know that she has passed away, and people that a couple of people I've spoken to on the show would still class her as one of the leading experts in the field of cultic studies, which I think is quite interesting, considering how much has come out in the last 10 years compared to how much was coming out sort of before that, which is interesting. But after you started to work with Margaret Singer to kind of develop your skills and to become sort of as qualified as you are now in the field of cult intervention and helping people to recover, what does your day-to-day basis look like now after sort of 30, 40 years involved in this work?
Yes, I think so. So I think we have to understand, we don't have to, one way of looking at Margaret Singer, and there's Dr. West, Jolly West, and Dr. Lifton and Shine, is these are the people that work for our government that treated the prisoners of war who came in from Korea. When at the time in the late 50s, it was thought that, these people are, one day they're Americans, the next day they've signed allegiance to another government. How does that happen? And the US really wanted to understand that and those mechanisms. And these were the unique people who tried to understand that process. So they were researchers on one level, and they were researchers in a style of research that we probably couldn't do today, because things were different. Different times or different ethical requirements. The prison experiment couldn't be done now. The research on electric shocks can't be done now. I mean, these are unethical. But at the time, they were on the cutting edge. And so they were trying to understand. And they were trying to understand what happened to people who came out of these environments. And there were some very large groups, and people were transforming really quickly, and they were giving an insight into what was happening. One of the things that I learned, I mean, Margaret used to stay at my house. I was away a few times, and she walked my dogs in Philly when she was here. I knew her fairly well. Her and Dr. West, I don't know if you've heard this name, Louis Jolene West. He was an amazing man, and he did some of the earliest research. He was at the neuropsychiatric unit at UCLA at the age of 29. He did some of the most fundamental research around things related to human potential, very criticized by people like Scientology, because he gave an elephant LSD, and they thought it was, the worst thing, and the elephant died. And knowing Dr. West, he explained the elephant was dying, and we needed to understand what was happening, and this was an opportunity. And this is how research was done at that time. Dr. West also funded research on TM, and I remember he was on the review boards, and I remember asking him, "Why are you approving their research?" And he said, "Because we need to understand, is what they're saying, is it accurate or not accurate?" And so he provided me with this insight in that a true researcher, a true, academic, and not that people could have different opinions, but someone with that kind of curiosity is going to fund those research because they want to know. They have that curiosity. Is there something that we can learn from this? So he was in a unique position. So I think that I learned a tremendous amount. My partner, Joe Kelly, he did an intervention one time with Dr. West. And I did one. I'll talk about them because I think that it was Dr. Singer and Dr. West together. And it was a lady who joined a very abusive Christian sect where her child was being treated horribly, physically, mentally, nutritionally. And the courts, and I think Margaret's testimony got that the lady would be evaluated. And Dr. West called Joe Kelly, Joe Zimhart, another interventionist, Carol Giambavo, to come out to his home. And it was around Christmas time, and he spent 3 weeks with this lady. And her little child, Charlie West was Jewish, and he got a Christmas tree. He made sure there was gifts for the baby. He showed that person respect because he wanted the child to know that there were people who loved them. And he showed the person who was potentially under influence that they were a human being, and he was going to show them respect. And that's something that he taught us that I think that helped make this shift that all groups are bad all the time to some groups are bad some of the time. There was a case in the UK where one of the House of Lords, and I'm going to talk about, I'm not violating confidentiality, one of the House of Lords' sons was in a group, Lord Seafield, the most successful estate in the UK. And his son got connected to a kind of group that, a Sufi sort of Al-Qaeda type group. And Dr. West was brought in to talk to them on a very remote part of the UK in a place called Noidart. It's off. I don't know if you've ever heard of Noidart. It's an amazing place. It's off the coast of Scotland, a little peninsula. You take a boat to get there. And Dr. West had Joe Kelly, Joe Zimhart, and myself come to talk to him. And he met us at the shore of the, and he drew out where we would be. And he described, he had a library brought in, and he described what we were going to be entering into, where we were going to sleep. He was this humanness to him, this very humanness. And he just didn't treat people like they were victims, or that everything was all bad.
Right.
And so when I think about me now, those things impacted me tremendously. Also, there are people that are very controversial, I would say, in this field, people that have some difficulty with. Eileen Barker from Inform. And I've learned tremendous amount from Dr. Barker. She's taught me many, many things. And so while I can understand how people might see her, I've brought cases to her of one guru who was sexually abusing women, and she testified in court and had that man put in jail. So she taught me also. Dr. Langoni from the International Cultic Studies Association, his concepts of that pushing it, and they had a connection with Dr. Barker, is that if you want things to change in abusive groups, very few groups have ever been shut down by the government. But what we can do is if we have dialogue with them, maybe we can reduce harm. So Dr. Langoni and Dr. Barker and many others come from a much more harm reduction model. and that by dialogue we can elicit change. So I had a unique experience working for the International Cultic Studies Association for 23 years, in that at conferences I would, at registration or whatever was going on, these people would come and register, and I thought they were the chief demons of the universe. I thought I was meeting Satan, and I wasn't nice to them. And I remember the president of the International Cultic Studies Association, Herb Rosedale, who's since deceased, he said, "Pat, you'll treat everyone with respect." And so they're humans too. They may have different viewpoints on certain things, but they also have helped facilitate change. And I think that one of the things, because the International Cultic Studies Association has open conferences, these are conferences that anyone can come to. I've met leaders of groups and have enough of a relationship with them because of my job at the time, that if there's somebody in their group that is really, we think is having a bad time, I can call them. And they know that if I say, I think John is not doing well, all the signs of that, can we maybe find John therapy? There's a willingness, and that's because of dialogue. So many people will not go as far as I will go in having dialogue with people that I might disagree on some things about. And so the nature of our work is to try to find commonality, to find the safe areas that we can communicate. And this is a problem that many families have, is Johnny joined the group. I don't know what to talk to him about. Really what they're saying is, Johnny joined, one thing they're saying is, Johnny joined a group, and everything I say to Johnny, he still says in the group. I don't know what to talk to him about. I don't know what to talk to him about to make him leave. What we try to do is to find things that they can talk about that are safe, so that it's not this intense criticism all the time. Like my father, what he taught me, that we can find those common grounds. And so I think I learned in these 38 years from a lot of different people. And if I go back to Dr. West, he taught me that one thing that I was so angry about is, why are you funding TM research? And he said, because we have to know what's going on. He taught me that. And I think that has stuck with me through my career, and has changed me as a person, of not looking at things so black and white, but looking at grays. And so I think that way of my way, or it's not my way, how I'm wired, this works for me. And I think that the people that are in groups that I speak with are not as alienated from someone like me, because I'm not in there to beat their group up. I'm there to help their families understand. And by way of helping their families understand, like happened to me, I'm able to expose them to ideas in a way that they feel safe. So I think that's very different.
It is, I think so. And I think it sounds almost progressive, and something that I think that I would like to adopt even into my own principles, and my own thoughts and feelings going forward, as somebody that is furthering my own education in the cultic field, just by having these discussions with people and reading, the texts that are available to us, and the various memoirs that I'm lucky enough to be sent. So that, I think what you've just said there is something I would like to adopt more of. So I'm gonna make a note of it as well, because when I write things down on paper, it seems to kind of stick with me more, and then I can relive this conversation when I edit our episode as well, which is great.
One thing that that's helpful is that different disciplines ask different questions. So if there is a group and it's let's say it's an abusive group or not an abusive group, a sociologist of religion may ask certain questions. How does that group work? How does it function? How does the leader function? What's the role of those? Yes, those kind of questions. We come from a more psychological bend that says, how is that group hurting somebody? Both are valid questions. And the analogy I would draw is a close friend of mine is New York Times, the photographer. And they were in Syria and Iraq, and they would photograph children being killed. And I'm like, well, a child is being killed. My thing would be to stop that child from being killed. I'm using an extreme example.
Mm-hmm.
But their job is to take pictures. Their job is to document that this is happening, so the rest of the world will know that it's happening. And so, yes, everything in them probably says, stop that, but then they get killed themselves. But that's what their question they're asking in a way. And so if we understand that different people ask different questions, we don't have to make them the enemy. We just can respect that this is the questions that they're asking. And I think that that's an important thing, at least for me. I will say to you that 25 years ago, it would not have been possible for me to do this. I didn't see the world that way. Part of that is getting older. and on this subject, I will say that we work sometimes with a Catholic monk who is connected with the Vatican and works with new religious movements, specifically the Hare Krishnas and Islam. And he works in the area of interfaith dialogue. And we had a discussion one time about how do you start interfaith dialogue? And he said, he said, Pat, so if we're, he was asking me, he's a clinical psychologist also. He said, so if we're sitting around a table and it's Catholic monks and there are these imams and we're having a discussion, how do you think we do it? Where do we start? And I'm like, I have no idea. He said, because, we believe Jesus is God and they don't. So if we start with Jesus God, no, he's not. Yes, he is. No, he's not. We get nowhere. So I said, so he said, do you know where we start? I go, no, I have no idea. He said, well, when Muhammad had his visions that we should get rid of the iconography in churches and cut off the crosses, when he had that vision, him and his brother went around cutting off the crosses and taking out the icons. But there was one icon in one church that his brother said he could stay. And that icon was a Mary holding the infant Jesus. So that's where we start. We start at the point of commonality, and then we move out. So I think that if we can find the areas of commonality, then, and for families, if we can find the areas of commonality and they focus on those, that doesn't mean there's not abuses, but you find the areas of commonality, we can then, what I started with this discussion with about art, if we can appreciate the art, then we have the right to criticize. If we can find the things that we agree with, then we can venture into the areas that we disagree with.
Again, I love that. I think that sounds, on paper, it sounds ideal.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not as easy to get to that point.
No, it's not. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. It's very easy for me to say, but it's not my kid who's crazy things. I was that kid, but it's how can you find, and I know my dad, who was a military man, after he found out I left, he was trying to understand what I meant by being influenced, or that word, he used the word brainwashed. And he said, he related back to going on to the Solomon Islands, that because his rank, he got the sailors riled up to go onto the island, and they were chanting. In this case, it was against the Japanese. Get the Japs, they got all riled up. And he said, I got them so riled up that they would do anything. He said, is that what it's like? He tried to find, and I always reflect on my dad, he tried to find the ways of understanding that had nothing to do with saying I was wrong. And it used to drive me crazy, because if I gave him a book on cults, he would call me up and say, Pat, there's 16 references that I'd like you to get me. And he would want the references that are in the book so he could read that, because he wanted to have a nuanced discussion.
Wow, he sounds incredible.
he was an amazing man.
And you mentioned before briefly your partner, Joe Kelly, as well, which was a name that I was going to mention at some point, because there is, for the last part of our discussion, something that I wanted to ask you about that you could bring to the listeners. For anybody that isn't aware of what you and Joe work on together. And actually, I happen to notice that there is a new name appearing at the bottom of my daily newsletter as well. Yeah. So I wondered if you could just talk us through your project, Cult News 101.
Certainly. So this has a long history, and we talked a little bit about the time when there was not the internet and CompuServe. And so the way people found out information about groups is you went to libraries, and there was a lovely lady in DC. Lois was her name. I can't think of her last name at this moment. And she would go to the Library of Congress every day, and she would go through newspapers and photostat, make copies of the articles on cults, and she would mail Lois Bell, and she would mail them off to us. And I remember I would send her books of stamps because, but that was what she did to get the information out. So everything that we knew became from newspapers, or, but somebody had to be at a Library of Congress or to read these newspapers. So when CompuServe came out, they had this service called a clipping service, where you could put in terms like Scientology, TM, and it would electronically clip those. And then you would have these articles. You didn't have to go to the Library of Congress. So we began assembling articles about many different groups in the late 80s. And we would send them out to people who had some ability to receive them electronically. And at some point in the mid-90s, I began working for the International Cultic Studies Association. It wasn't called that at this time. And there was a woman there, Carol Giambavo. We came together and we started sending things out together. Why duplicate? And then when I worked for ICSA, we sent it out underneath the banner of ICSA's name. But we were building this huge database of articles and information. And then when I left there about 8 years ago, we just continued. And so Joe is one of the people who worked for ICSA in the past, and his job was to search the internet for articles about groups. So that was logical. Okay. And Ashlyn, who used to work for the International Cultic Studies Association, she just finished, I think, our master's program at the University of Salford in coercive control. And her special interest is in people born and raised in groups and reproductive coercion. So Ashlyn joined on with us with the idea that maybe on the weekends she would focus on the articles that relate to the subjects that she finds interesting. And so Ashlyn's an amazing person. She works with us on intervention work. So it's just a amazing pleasure to have someone who is young, who looks at this through a different lens than a 64-year-old man does. There's a different way of perceiving what's important and what's not important. Ashlyn, having been born and raised in a group, she brings another insight that is not my experience. So I think that this Cult News 101 is I hate the word cult so many times that I try to get people not to use it, but it's what people are aware of. It's a way of sharing kind of different perspectives. And so sometimes you'll see press releases from groups in our daily news. You'll see articles, legal articles. You'll see a lot of different perspectives, because I believe that if you're worried about someone, you should read everything you can, which includes what the group says about itself.
Yeah.
You should talk with people who are current members, former members. You should understand the group, because if you don't understand it, you don't have the right to criticize. And if you only select the things that say that group is bad, you're going to have a skewed perspective, and your loved one who's in the group, any decent group, has inoculated their members about the negative things. So let's look at the whole picture, become conversant in that. And so I think that Ashlyn brings a unique perspective that is different than my perspective. And we're demonstrating what we're putting our mouths, we're doing what we say. bring different people from different perspectives in.
Absolutely.
So Cult News 101 gets sent out 6 days a week. You've probably seen. It's in there at 3 a.m. It's usually there. Although yesterday yesterday we got hacked for some reason. And then there's a website, Cult News 101, where there's all these articles, and there's a Facebook version and a Twitter version, an Instagram version. There's lots of versions of Cult News 101.
And I do recommend anybody that's interested in staying up to date with changes in cases, as things move through trials, as anniversaries come and go of significant events throughout history. I wake up every morning. Most of the time, my email from Pat is in my inbox with kind of the most recent headlines and newspaper stories. And if it's not, I'm kind of like, where's my email? It's one of the first things I do when I wake up in the morning.
I'm really pleased that you find it helpful.
I do. I find it really helpful, and I was lucky enough to actually speak to Aileen on Zoom a few weeks back to ask her what her thoughts were on the master's degree in Salford, because that's a stone's throw away from me, and to have a master's degree focused on that subject when I'm putting so much of my time into it, I was like, it would be strange not to consider that. So I got to speak to Aileen. She was very warm and friendly and did agree to come and speak on the show in a few months' time. So hopefully we'll be able to bring that discussion to the listeners around Aisleen's time in that non-institutional Church of Christ, I believe.
Yes.
Which was the same group that a past guest, Evie, was involved in, and Evie is going to be appearing at the ICSA conference this year, which I think will have actually been and gone by the time this episode comes out. And I think you're actually speaking there as well, aren't you, Pat?
I am. I'm actually putting the conference on, so I'm the one who's running the conference. But if this comes and goes, almost except for maybe 6 of the talks will be on YouTube for people to see. So you can attend the conference. There's over 70 different sessions in 3 days. And
it looks incredible every time I go and have a little look through the schedule, because I've been lucky enough to have a ticket to the event donated to me, which was great, through a foundation. So that was great. And I'm looking at all the different things that are going to be discussed, and it's like going to a music festival and all your favorite bands are playing at the same time, and you're like, how am I gonna do this? Because even though the speakers may deliver the same panel the next day at a different time, it's like a big puzzle that you have to put together to make sure that you really get the most out of it. So it's not a surprise to me that the majority of the content will be uploaded to YouTube for people to watch later. It just looks like it's going to be an absolutely chock full weekend of just modern ideas, theories, explorations of various groups, people's personal experiences in certain groups, looking at one theme within things like new religious movements, whether that's like the history of racism in new religious movements. There's like absolutely something for everyone. So the International Cultic Studies Association, if anybody isn't aware of that, you can sign up to their website as well. And there's a ton of resources on the website, but you can also sign up to Cult News 101 and get Pat's emails every day as well in your inbox, giving you and on Instagram as well, Cult News 101. So if anybody would like their daily dose of what's going on in the world of cults, then that's the place to go.
Great, I appreciate that. So you can sign it up if they go to cultnews101.com, and in the upper right hand corner there's a sign up, and you'll get it every day or 6 days a week.
Amazing. That's great. Thank you so much, Pat, for coming and talking us through your life, your experiences, how your mindset has changed throughout the years as you've as you've learned, as you've had conversations with people, as you've grown older, and had a chance to be able to reflect on how you think and feel about things, and kind of really get to a point that I think is really progressive and respectable. And I'm going to take as much from what you've said today as possible. And anybody that was wondering what transcendental meditation is or was, they now can listen to this episode and have a full history of it. And I think it's been a bit of a roller coaster going from being 17 to kind of where you are now. But I really appreciate your time, Pat. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Cheers.
I will speak to you soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Right. Take care. Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.